We'll go ahead and start. It's about 11:31. I believe in being decent and in order. So thank you all so very much for coming. My name is Camille Burge. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. I'm also the assistant director for the Center for Peace and Justice Education. Our Freedom School session today is titled, "We Shall Overcome: Understanding the Effects of Race-Based Trauma on Mental Health." So how did we get to this topic? Well, many people are familiar with the civil rights-oriented legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. However, a great deal are unaware of the impact of trauma on Dr. King's mental health, including the depression he suffered throughout his life. Dr. King attempted suicide twice before the age of 13, once when he thought his grandmother was dead, but she was actually unconscious at the time, and on the day that his grandmother actually died. As an adult, he experienced severe bouts of depression while leading the civil rights movement. He was jailed 29 times and lived under the constant threat of physical harm, even surviving an assassination attempt in September of 1958. His staff tried to get him psychiatric treatment, which he turned down. Yet we do not discuss this important aspect of the lived experience of Dr. King. The late, great Dr. King once stated, "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter." In this Freedom School, we want to shed light on race-based trauma, especially in the context of discrimination, oppression, and violence, and the effects that this trauma has on one's mental health. Dr. Eloise, our beloved director of the Office of Intercultural Affairs, will begin by defining race-based trauma and race-based traumatic stress. Dr. Berry earned her BA in psychology from Villanova University and her MS and PhD in counseling psychology with the specialization in child clinical and family from Virginia Commonwealth University. She completed a postdoctoral fellowship in adolescent medicine at Children's Hospital at Harvard Medical School. She has many years of experience working with college-age young adults across multiple settings, and she provides psychological services for Bryn Mawr Psychological Associates. After Dr. Berry speaks, Dr. Taunya Tinsley, who's an assistant teaching professor in the Department of Education and Counseling, will address the impact of race-based trauma and traumatic stress over one's lifespan. Dr. Tinsley holds a BA in Business Administration from Augsburg College in Minneapolis, Minnesota, a master's degree in Higher Education Administration and College Student Development from the University of Iowa, and 2 doctorates, a PhD in Counselor Education and Supervision, and a Doctor of Ministry with the focus in prophetic congregational development using 21st century methods. In addition to providing academic and administrative services, Dr. Tinsley is the owner of Transitions Counseling Service, LLC, and Life Skills Program that includes a ministry division, Love and Basketball Ministries, where she provides individual, marriage, family, and group counseling and consultative services. After they both speak, they'll provide us with information on how we might cope with race-based traumatic stress. When the coping mechanisms are discussed, I'll come back to the podium, and I'll address how these traumas manifest in the political arena. We're thinking about politics, especially in the last 6, 8 to 10 years. People have defined elections as traumatic experiences. Lots of emotions are involved in these elections, especially emotions experienced at the group level. And so I want to understand how this race-based trauma gets translated into the political space. So just to review, Dr. Berry will speak first, Dr. Tinsley second. They'll then talk about coping mechanisms and strategies together. And if there's still time, I do hope to speak about the political landscape, and especially thinking about 2020. And just as a fair warning, this conversation may trigger a wide range of emotional reactions, but we look forward to learning and growing with you over the next hour, and hope that this will be the beginning of an ongoing conversation on campus and in your personal lives. Thank you.
So I'm going to provide a bunch of definitions. So hopefully I'm not doing too much reading, but I want to make sure we have a common language in terms of thinking about the issues we're going to discuss. So I wanted to start off with a definition of trauma, first of all, and this is provided by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, so a really reputable organization. And its individual trauma results from an event or set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So the person is potentially affected in many, many realms. Another definition I want to provide is that with regard to racial trauma in particular. So you got the basics for trauma. Racial trauma is a term used to describe physical and psychological symptoms that people of color experience after exposure to particularly stressful experiences of racism. So with that, another definition, because I want to make sure we're all on the same page. Racism. Has everyone heard that word? Everyone have a sense of what it means? So racism is about power, first of all, and it's systemic. So it's a systemic subordination of members of targeted racial groups who have relatively little social power by members of the agent racial group who have relatively most social power. So in the United States, that would be people who are from the Black community, maybe Latinx. So those communities, Asian even, and the dominant group would be the people from the white community. So this subordination, and this is key, is supported by the actions of individuals, cultural norms, and values, and the institutional structures and approaches of society. So it's not just one person, it could be something that's more blanketed. For example, I don't know if you've ever heard of racial discrimination or racism in particular with regard to housing policies, where certain individuals weren't allowed to get loans, weren't allowed to even be in a place to be eligible for housing in certain communities. So if you would, over time, look at why those communities weren't diverse, it kind of made sense. Individuals were not allowed to be in those circumstances to begin with. So with regard to trauma and racial trauma, it's experienced as real or perceived discrimination. And I think that's important to note, real or perceived. Racial harassment. You ever hear of secondary or vicarious traumatization? So basically you're watching it happen to someone else and it still affects you. Maybe as strongly as a person it's happening to, or it could be watered down a bit, but either way, there is a great impact. For example, if a person of color is watching something about police brutality, they may not have experienced the police brutality, but because they are part of that group that tends to be targeted, might feel traumatized by that experience. Does that make sense to everyone? And something that if you were in a session earlier, and maybe you've just heard of it in general, but something we call microaggressions, which people think micro, when you think small, it doesn't really matter, it's not so much of a big deal. It really is a big deal because, ironically, the pressure of microaggressions can be heavier in some cases because they happen more frequently. So I'm just going to explain what they are. They are small, generally, racist acts that are not clearly racially motivated. So for example, I could say personally I've had this happen, where someone has said, oh, well, you're not like the others. And referring to that it's like a compliment. You're smart, you're great, you're nice. It's like, well, what does that mean about the others? So you can see how that would be a slight. even if the person didn't necessarily intend it that way, that would be perceived by myself as a slight and most other people of color. So just to talk about a few types of microaggressions. There are the micro assaults that are a little more explicit where, and it's funny because I don't know how this wasn't just straight out racism, but it's more so maybe someone calling someone a name or something that is specifically racially motivated in a negative way. And typically it could be a verbal attack or some discriminatory behavior. A micro insult is characterized by communications that convey rudeness and insensitivity and demean a person's racial heritage or identity. And then finally, a micro invalidation is a verbal comment or behavior that may exclude or negate or nullify the thoughts or feelings of the experiential reality of a person of color. So, for example, if you have a friend who's a person of color and they say, you know, hey, I was walking around the mall and I noticed that, you know, every time I walked into a store, I saw the security guard walk by that store. You might say, oh gosh, that was just a coincidence. Unfortunately, a lot of times it's not a coincidence. So in those circumstances, you could have, be in a position of having one of these micro invalidations if you tell the person, oh, you know what, don't be so sensitive. That's probably not the case. Okay, does that make sense? Now I want to talk a little bit about how racism causes trauma, period. So it's an act of, the act is a violation of an individual's personhood. The victim feels disempowered and powerless. The event is unpredictable and uncontrollable. So a person going to the mall just may have decided to go to the mall. They didn't expect to have this situation happen. The event may be challenged or ridiculed by others. So again, it's their experience, but someone else may challenge it or negate it in some way. So that actually went pretty fast. So now Dr. Tinsley is going to talk about the impact of trauma across the lifespan, especially racial trauma.
Good morning, everyone. You guys still with us? Okay, so one of the things I know when I'm presenting, we have this thing called call and response, so that I know that you're still with us. If you hear something, you say amen, hallelujah, praise the Lord, or something so that I know, or nod your head. Is that okay? All right.
Yes.
So I appreciate Dr. Berry giving us the definitions. And I also appreciate Dr. Burge giving us some background about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I just want to reiterate a couple things that she said, because I'm going to use Dr. King as an example as part of our case study, but then also weaving that in and what that might mean for us here on Villanova's campus and in our cultural context. So just to reiterate what Dr. Burge said, Dr. King's mental health, let me start over. Dr. Martin Luther King has a great deal of unaware of the impact of trauma on Dr. King's mental health, including depression he suffered throughout his lifespan. So when we say lifespan, we're talking about childhood to adulthood. Dr. King attempted suicide twice before the age of 13. Okay, so now we're still talking about childhood and leading into adolescence. Once, when he thought his grandmother was dead, she was actually unconscious, and on the day that his grandmother actually died. As an adult, he experienced severe bouts of depression while leading the civil rights movement. He was jailed 29 times and lived under the constant threat of physical harm, even surviving an assassination attempt in September of 1958. Historically, in the Black and African American communities, there is a stigma about being diagnosed or accepting a diagnosis of depression, trauma, post-traumatic stress, okay? And so when we go back to the time that Martin Luther King was a child, to really accept this idea of PTSD or depression was not something that was common in the Black community. And so if we were to take the research and what we know now, we may be able to go back and say that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. may have suffered from PTSD. So we as clinicians, Dr. Berry and I, when we are diagnosing someone, we use what's called the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistic Manual. And in the DSM, it really talks about criteria to be diagnosed with PTSD. But one of the things that we can do now is we can diagnose children as young as 6 years old with PTSD. So historically, we could not start to diagnose a child or adolescent until they turned 18. So knowing what we know now, we could have started looking at criteria and what was going on in Dr. Martin Luther King's life to identify if he was experiencing some traumatic experiences, something that may have contributed to his level of depression, for him to want to attempt suicide and have these suicidal ideations at 13. It is normal to have upsetting memories, feel on edge, or have trouble sleeping after a traumatic event. At first, it may be hard to do normal daily activities like go to work, go to school, or spend time with people you care about. But most people start to feel better after a few weeks or months. If it's been longer than a few months and you're still having symptoms, you may have PTSD. For some people, PTSD symptoms may start later on. So they may have experienced a traumatic event in childhood, but it may not manifest and start to show up until adolescence or adulthood. Or these symptoms may happen over time. So I wanted to say that because when we talk about Dr. Martin Luther King and we talk about race-based trauma today, there are many types of trauma, but I come from this philosophical stance that early development impacts later development. And we have research to support that this early development impacts later development. So there was a study, Adverse Childhood Experiences study, that was conducted on a group of adults in California. And the group, the population, the sample was predominantly white and middle-class adults. And what they did was to assess, using 10 questions, whether or not this population had experienced some type of traumatic experience. So 5 of the questions are personal and 5 are related to some other family members. So had they experienced physical abuse? Had they experienced verbal abuse, sexual abuse, physical neglect, or emotional neglect? Those type of experiences contribute to trauma. Now, some people can be very resilient with supportive caretakers, mentors. However, if they start to experience those same types of behavior in adulthood, later adolescence, adulthood, it may trigger those trauma symptoms again, and they may come to surface. So somebody may be experiencing something in the present day, but also now going back to some unfinished business earlier on. The factors that are related to family members: a parent who's an alcoholic, a mother who's a victim of domestic violence, a family member in jail, a family member diagnosed with a mental illness, and the disappearance of a parent through divorce, death, or abandonment. Other types of childhood trauma include racism. So we just talked about racism. Bullying, watching a sibling being abused, a father abusing a mother or a grandmother abusing a father, losing a caregiver, homelessness, surviving and recovering from a severe accident, foster care, or juvenile justice. So if we think about this idea of Dr. Martin Luther King attempting suicide twice because of a loss of a caretaker, he's already starting to experience some traumatic events. Now we look at his cultural context and the systemic that Dr. Berry talked about with racism. We add that to his already existing trauma, and that may have contribute to his level of depression over the lifespan. The research has shown that there is a direct link between childhood trauma and adult onset of chronic disease, depression, anxiety, suicide ideation, suicide attempts, suicide completion, and being a victim of violence. It may also increase the risk of health symptoms. There is a word, it's called psychosomatic. There are some times where people will experience some type of physical pain manifested in their body. When they go to a medical doctor, the medical doctor can't identify. It may be something going on psychologically. So trauma can impact a person from a psychosomatic, back pains, having headaches all the time, having stomach pains. So these are kinds of symptoms that can impact even a person today, that can get in the way of their being effective in their interpersonal relationships, being effective in their classes and academics and extracurricular activities. So with all of that being said, because I do want to turn it back over to Dr. Burge, some of the things that we have to remember. If somebody is experiencing depression or some type of trauma, they may be sad, teary-eyed, range of emotions going up and down, anger, fear, feeling shameful, okay? So one of the things that we want to make sure, there could be also a loss of appetite, avoidance, not engaging in daily activities. So I'm not going to class, I'm not going to work. So it's starting to get in the way of the person's daily functioning. So as I lead into techniques and strategies, and Dr. Berry will add as well, one, we want to make sure we assist individuals with improving their coping, managing their emotions, emotional regulation, managing impulses that they may have. We want to help the person find hope and meaning. Because oftentimes if somebody's avoiding, let's say somebody's avoiding going to a class because there was a microaggression that happened in the class. We have to help that student, or we may have to help that faculty with how do I find hope and meaning and still complete the class, as well as having support. So we also may have to increase skills in communication, increase skills in problem solving. As supportive people, all of us can be support systems. Empathic understanding, not discrediting someone's experience. No, that really didn't happen. Maybe that didn't. We can't do that. We have to provide empathic support. So we have to affirm people's experience, affirm their racial and cultural identity and the experiences that they may have. And one of the things that I would like to challenge all of us here today, and I would like to challenge Villanova University, we become a trauma-informed institution. And as a trauma-informed institution, we realize the impact of race-based trauma and other types of trauma that people on our campus may experience. We recognize the signs and symptoms and not just kind of discredit them that they're not showing up for class or they're not turning in their homework assignments, but could there be something that's going on? We respond fully by integrating the knowledge that we know, and if we still need to learn more information, utilizing the support systems that we have on campus and our various offices that we have on campus. And we also have to recognize that we could potentially traumatize people based on microaggressions. So we have to resist re-traumatizing people. And so those are some of the strategies that I would give, and I would also share with Dr. Berry. She has some strategies.
And the strategies I'm going to share now are directly related to the experience of racism, and it's actually from something called Racism Recovery Plan. So they're different steps. And one thing when I read this, I actually did a presentation on this a couple of years ago, and it first struck me that the premise is a person of color in the United States will experience racism. That's it. So with that, a lot of it is about being able to prepare yourself and also to, when those things happen, be able to manage. So one of the suggestions, which actually I like, because I always think of when I see my clients, whether they're adults, children, or even people your age, I sort of ask them, what is it like when you're doing well? Like, can you paint a picture for me of the best times? You know, when you're feeling at your best, when, you know, everything's clicking, so that we can work back to that point. Because that's going to be different for everyone. So with regard to this racial wellness toolbox, one of the suggestions is describing what you're like when you're managing and responding to racism in a healthy manner. So again, the idea is that it's going to happen. But what is it like when you are responding in a healthy manner? And thinking about what Dr. Burge is going to speak more about with the political landscape, being ready, even knowing that most likely that we're going to have some issues with race that come up. In addition, just a few other things that they noted. It's something they suggested as a daily maintenance plan where you, and this, I don't know if people have heard of racial identity theory. Anybody ever hear of that? If you Google it or look it up, you will find lots of information, probably more than you want. But the whole idea is, and this is for people of color, and they actually have one for white identity as well, but based on where you are within your development, you may respond to the same situation very differently than someone else. So it's important to sort of know where you are so you can kind of get a sense of what might be your triggers, or maybe things that you can manage and won't be really difficult. So I really would recommend that in all of your free time. Connecting with friends, and Dr. Tinsley talked about the support angle, but connecting with friends who are equally or better able to engage in conversations about racial awareness. So you may have some friends who, you know, it's not on their radar, so they probably won't be so helpful. Maybe once you get in a place where you can actually move them along, that would be a way to assist them. But for you, for your own needs, being able to have peers, you know, adults, you know, who are in a place where they can have those discussions, it's really, really important. It's something about being able to be almost like fortified or strengthened. So one thing that I'm sure my co-presenters would agree with is the idea of engaging in prayer, spiritual practice, and use of mantras to stay positive.
Amen.
Amen. Yes, yes, yes. I don't know. I'm just gonna take a little sidetrack for a second. Anyone ever hear of the expression "too blessed to be stressed"? Okay, you can hear that on some level, but even the most blessed, and I think Dr. King was pretty blessed, right? Still experienced stress. So do not let that be the reason you don't seek additional support if you really are experiencing stress. You'd be like, oh no, God's not failing me. No, God's not failing you. It's just, you're human. And you have the right to experience something that's really difficult, and it may be difficult to you. Engaging in activism. How many people were at the talk last night? So that looks like about 25%, 30%. There was the idea of all of us, especially all of you, have the ability to make such change throughout the world, and definitely in the United States. So being able to engage in activism and basically focus those energies into something that's positive and that makes a difference. And then finally, which is something I talk to my clients about all the time, is practice self-management. And this could be for racial trauma or any kind of trauma. Healthy eating, exercise, and favorite activities that help you feel centered. That's not just once a week. Ideally, that's something that a person finds time for daily. Because you have to be at a level of being able to function, hopefully. I always talk about baseline. So you want your baseline to be at a level where if some assault happens, you don't dip down so low. If your baseline is so low to begin with, if something happens, you're going to be rock bottom. So doing those things daily to support development, support thriving is important. So you almost have, I always think of like I grew up liking superheroes. So like Superman, Wonder Woman in particular, of course I'm a woman, how she had those. So basically if something happens, you can ward it off a little bit better. Okay, I think this may be videotaped. They're gonna be like, what the heck is she doing? So that's my contribution.
It's about 12, so I'll go quick. So we've defined race-based trauma. We've talked about race-based trauma over the lifespan. I just want to talk a bit more about emotions. So how might our experiences with race-based trauma make us feel? What are some emotions that might be evoked when we're experiencing these traumas? And in particular, how are these emotions translated into the political space? So my research interests lie at the intersection of political psychology and racial and ethnic politics. And in particular, I'm interested in studying how we experience emotions as members of groups, and what that means for how we behave, what that means for whether we vote, we protest, we donate money to candidates, we sign petitions. I'm really interested in group-centered emotions, and I've spent the last 8 years or so thinking and publishing about how Black Americans especially experience pride, shame, and anger as members of their racial group, and what it means for their politics. But since we're talking about race-based trauma today, I want to broaden the scope to racial and ethnic groups broadly construed, so not just African Americans, and focus on the collective experiences of shame, fear, and anger. So I'll begin by explaining some of the psychological theories that I engage in my work. I'll then define shame, fear, and anger, and provide some findings from the extant literature about collective experiences of emotions. And then I'll discuss how these things get translated into the political space, right? Especially with an upcoming election. Lots of folks have talked about different comments that have been made by Democrats and Republicans that are really racist. How do those things get translated in the political space? So as a political psychology scholar, I borrow theories from psychology scholars to help explain political phenomena. And two of the psych theories that I borrow in my research are called group-based and intergroup emotions. So group-based emotions and intergroup emotions. So when we're talking about group-based emotions, they tend to have an in-group object and an in-group subject. So two psychology scholars state that individual group members may experience emotions about their in-group's character, their circumstances or position, including its treatment by others, or the actions undertaken by the group or a few of its members. And so the idea surrounding group-based emotions is that members of groups become psychologically bonded together from the perspective of oneself and outsiders. So the events and actions that are caused by or affect other in-group members have the capacity to affect oneself. So think about, if we're not talking about race, your Villanova identity. When the men's basketball team wins, you're like, yes, we won. We, us, our team is fantastic. It's all good. If they lose, I can't believe they lost, right? Them, they, their, third person plural pronouns. I don't even know them. Who are these guys, right? So it's these actions that are taken by members of our group that might lead us to have some emotional response. So thinking about members of your racial group, your gender group, your religious group, your partisan group, if people do things you do and don't like, it might affect how you emotionally react to the situation, as well as your subsequent actions. Intergroup emotions differ from group-based emotions in that they have an out-group object and an in-group subject. So these kinds of emotions may be experienced about an out-group's character or circumstances relative to the in-group, or about the actions of the out-group and its implications for the in-group, right? And it's the second part of this definition that really matters for us today when we're thinking about race-based trauma, because it's the actions of members of perhaps racial out-groups that are affecting how you feel, right? Actions that may cause violence, that may cause discrimination, that may be oppressive, that is going to affect how you feel along with your subsequent actions and reactions. So what kinds of emotions are evoked if you're Black and you see young Black men and or women assaulted or shot and killed on video by a police officer? What kinds of emotions are evoked when you hear the phrase, go back to your own country? What kinds of emotions are evoked if you identify as a member of the Latinx community and see members of the larger community or the larger group being detained at the border or deported for frivolous reasons? or the emotions that are evoked when racial slurs are hurled at you when you're cloaked in religious garb. We have emotional reactions to all of those things. And so within the political science literature, we want to understand especially how emotions shape our politics, because our politics are very emotionally charged. And what I argue in my work is that those emotions are tied not just to individuals, but to groups. How you feel as a woman, how you might feel as a white male or a white woman or a single woman with children, how you might feel as an African American. So really quick, I'm going to give you the definitions of shame, fear, and anger, a little bit about politics, and then I'm out because we want you to be able to ask questions that we can answer. So shame is defined as an all-consuming experience of the self as fundamentally flawed or defective. It's also defined as an affective reaction that follows public exposure and disapproval. It can be generated by appraisals that one has failed to live up to standards of worth in the eyes of others. So when we are experiencing some race-based trauma, shame might be a natural reaction that you have. Perhaps some internalized sense of shame. Research especially suggests that members of marginalized racial and ethnic groups feel a great deal of shame when they witness others who share their group identity engaging in behaviors that are seen as conforming to negative stereotypes. In other words, just as through my own misdeed, I might feel ashamed of who I am, when a group member engages in a wrongdoing, especially racial and ethnic minorities, I might feel ashamed of who we are. So why shame? Why would this be a reaction? Well, as a person of color, you know that stereotype is how perhaps a non-racial group member is evaluating you. That perhaps because of implicit bias, people that have never interacted with you, that have never encountered you, will, in the words of Valerie Kaur, not look upon you with wonder, like she was explaining last night, but in most cases, they're going to stereotype you, and that shapes how you're treated. What does it mean when someone tells you you're not good enough or smart enough or pretty enough, or when you're overlooked in class when you've had your hand raised? If your professor dismisses your statement as a person of color, but then validates a non-person of color's the exact same statement you just made, what does that do in the classroom space in terms of how you feel? It has an emotional effect. Fear, in addition to shame, fear is a vital response to physical and emotional danger. If we didn't feel it, we couldn't protect ourselves from legitimate threats. Richard Lazarus, another psychologist, prefers the term fright to fear because it involves threats that are concrete and sudden. It's the danger of imminent physical harm. In an effort to explain the distinctions between anxiety and fear, another author, Avril, states, ask a person who is afraid what he fears, and generally he can tell you. Ask him what you would like to do, and he can tell you that too. By contrast, the person who is suffering an anxiety attack may not be able to say what he or she is anxious about or what they want us to do. So not only when we're talking about these traumatic experiences might shame emerge, we're also thinking about the role of fear. And lastly, anger. Anger is defined as a belief that we or our friends have been unfairly slighted. It causes in us both painful feelings and a desire or impulse for revenge. Antoine Banks, he's at the University of Maryland, he's a political scientist. He states that anger is experienced when a person has been threatened, and more importantly, when an individual is certain about who's responsible for the offense. So Lazarus states that if we blame someone for the wrongdoing, it requires that we believe the individual could have engaged in a different behavior, and yet they chose to offend. Right? So we can blame somebody for the action because we think there could have been another course of action. When we're angry, psychology research suggests that it brings about the following action tendencies. It produces a desire to regain control, remove the obstruction, and if necessary, attack the source of injury. So imagine if we're driving down the street, someone cuts us off, like in these crazy Philly streets. Our immediate reaction is anger. You know, and why is that? It's because we believe that the person who cut us off didn't have to do it. But you did it anyways. So when we're talking about anger occurring, participating in oppressive actions, discriminatory acts, and even violence is a choice. As easy as it is to choose to engage in these actions, one can also choose not to. Which is why when these traumatic events happen, we naturally become angry. anger, fear, and shame in the 2020 election. I have so much data because I'm the major polling head, but I'll just put all of that aside. When we're thinking about political reactions or how emotions get charged in the political space, we tend to think that anger does the greatest deal of work, right? That anger causes people, at least what we've found, to participate in more costly forms of political engagement. So voting, going out to protest, donating money to candidates, as opposed to cheap forms of participation, which would be like signing a petition, which depending on where you are in your life, could also be very costly. However, the research focuses definitely on voting, protesting, donating money, some of these more costly forms. And what's fascinating to me are the different groups that are feeling these emotions in the political space, right? So in addition to racial and ethnic groups, which I'll talk about in 2 seconds, women, of course, are pissed, and women of color especially. But when we're thinking about recent protests and the women's movement typically being framed as like a white women's movement and even being separated from black women and women of color, all women are really upset. And when we're looking at turnout for the 2018 elections, African American women turned out overwhelmingly for the Democratic candidate. I think it's like 96% of African American women turned out to support Democrats. Single white women with children and women who are independents also in the midterm elections turned out overwhelmingly for Democrats. When we're thinking about the Latinx community, Latino women turned out, I think, at 76% in terms of when we're looking at the entire rate for Democratic candidates, whereas in 2016 it was about 69%, so there's a large bump there. When we're thinking about fear, especially in the electoral space, white men and fear, quite a bit has been written on white identity politics. Thinking about white men and white people in particular becoming the minority, the impending minority status, and how that's leading people to engage in the political space. Fear of African Americans, Latinos, as well as Arab Americans, and things of that nature. I have all of these quotes. But that's all I'll say for now, because we want to give you all some time to talk, because we have about 15 minutes left. But just thinking in particular, not necessarily about just the definition of race-based trauma or race-based trauma over the lifespan, but the ways in which these traumatic experiences like shape our emotions. And then thinking in particular, since it's an election year, how these emotions then get translated into the political space based on these group identities. All right? So, thank you. Any questions? Thoughts?
Yeah, so when someone's opening up about like a traumatic or like event, like where they experience racism, how would someone, how would you say someone should respond, or like, and someone like say like not of color would respond, since like you haven't really experienced that or like experienced that like situation exactly, how would you say someone should respond?
I can go and then you go. So one of my favorite books is To Kill a Mockingbird, and Atticus Finch says to Jim, to truly understand a person, you have to walk in their shoes. So I would say try to walk in their shoes. Seek to understand, then to be understood. So really kind of being that empathic friend and tell me about your experience. Not discrediting the experience, affirming the experience. Because sometimes people just need somebody to listen and say, yeah, that really did happen. Because sometimes the question is, did that just really happen? Did they really just, and I just need somebody to listen, affirm what my experience was, and say, yes, that really did happen. So sometimes it's just being there to listen, to understand their experience. And I would say the next step is to include them in the process. How would you like me to help? What can I do to further assist you?
And I would say, this is being taped, so hopefully I won't get in trouble. But keep your response real. I mean, especially if you feel like that you're connected to that person, you're listening to their experience, and you're touched by it. Tell them, yo, that's fucked up. That shouldn't have happened to you. I have your back. You know what I mean? All those things make a person feel like, yo, I'm not alone in this. And I think that's really, really important, especially knowing, it's one thing to have that from a person from their own community, but to have that from a person who isn't from the community is really powerful.
And I want to add, because you said the word, I don't want to feel alone in this. And so we're talking about, we led in using Martin Luther King with depression. And oftentimes, somebody who's experiencing depression may isolate themselves. And so we need to connect with people, because if I feel alone, I'm going to start to disconnect, and that's what we want to prevent. And preventing the depression, preventing isolation, and them not being involved.
Why do you think, like, to this day, there's such a stigma for the Black communities about mental health disorders or just dealing with it?
Start on that.
Oh, yeah.
That's a whole other lecture.
I can say for me, from my perspective and my research, because I integrate spiritual and Christian perspectives, in the civil rights movement, the church was the hub. So whenever there was an issue or a problem, the first place you go to is the church, and you go to God. And I even have clients today that will make the step to come into counseling, but say, you know, God is going to handle all of my problems. And the way my pastor has said it is that you are absolutely right. He may handle your problems by placing a trained professional in front of you. So we have to shift that perspective that we can include God in the process, and that it is okay to be able to seek out resources as it relates to the stigmas to mental health.
And I'm going to take it back a little bit farther. The whole idea, just the fact that slavery happened, a lot of, obviously, if we're Black people and we're alive now, we had people who were engaged in that at some point and had that trauma. So it's almost like looking back, they were able to overcome and deal with so many things. How can I complain about the fact that maybe something bad happened or something's not going my way? So I think sometimes communities of color, and I'll say Black people in particular, may think they need to be stronger and that they shouldn't get help, or to say that you're struggling is a sign of weakness. And people don't want to be perceived as weak a lot of times. I think this happens with males a lot too. So that piece of it there, if we can break through it, then more people will seek support and actually turn that on its head and say, you know what, it's actually stronger that I'm able to step out and take care of myself. So I think they go together.
And I would also add, when we talk about the results and the experiences from slavery and the civil rights movement, there's always been these racial contentions between Black and white. And right now, in the field of professional counseling and therapy, majority of therapists are white. And so there is this historical unspoken statement or spoken statement, you don't go and tell a white person and tell them your problems. And so I come from the perspective that right now, you don't have to have a perfect match to have help by somebody who looks like you, but we can train clinicians and psychologists and counselors to be multicultural and social justice competent. So there is that perception that I can't go talk to somebody who's white because they're going to, the statement is, how do I know when I come into your session and start to disclose this intimate most aspect of who I am, that you won't treat me like how somebody who looks like you out there treats me? And so there is this kind of mistrust.
So my question is, I was here in 2016 during the election season, and I'll probably get in trouble for this too, but I don't think Villanova handled it very well, the after effects of it, and I think that I personally experienced some traumatic experiences after that election, and I think that coming into 2020 election, I think that there should be more preparation for that, and I was just wondering in terms of Villanova centric, how that might look.
Whew. I don't have an answer for you, but I can tell you that across the United States, there are a number of groups, individuals experiencing large levels of anxiety that we're seeing in some of these questions that we have on national surveys. Thinking about what's going to happen in the election, the lead into the election, the outcome depending on whatever side you're on. Like, I'm talking about everybody across the spectrum. And I think your question is a great one, because I don't know that, sorry, video. I don't know that anything is being done to prepare.
And if it is, it's in pockets.
Right.
Probably not a whole school
The,
approach.
I just got an email yesterday asking if I wanted to be involved in this really large student involvement about getting people excited about voting, right? That's not at all preparing people for, racial, ethnic, religious tensions that might be stirred up on campus. And I think that's a really good question, especially since we have the director of Intercultural Affairs here, that needs to be addressed to help ensure that there, or at least to help minimize some of the race-based traumatic events that might occur in the lead-in or in the aftermath of the election. So I think it's a good question, and I don't have an answer to it. Dr. Nance is in the back. She just rolled through.
You want to say something?
So she might have an answer, but I don't as of right now. But I think it's a good point to make sure that there is something in place, that there are workshops that we are actively planning, because it's not just
it's inevitable.
It's inevitable.
Right. And I will add what I said at the beginning. I wanted to be on camera. I will challenge Villanova University to become a trauma-informed institution. So that means we have to train people, students, faculty, staff, to understand the different types of trauma, including the race-based trauma, gender-based trauma, religious-based trauma, to be able to provide the support to students, faculty, and staff.
Let's say that someone,
Go ahead.
Oh, Doctor. I'm sorry.
You're good.
let's say someone has experienced a situation of microaggression,
Sure.
and is then later on looking to confront the microaggressor. What do you think is the most, I guess, I know it depends on the situation, but in general, the most effective way to confront that microaggressor?
Yeah. I could say, it's a little easier if that person's a friend. So that would be one circumstance, because you can say, I've been thinking about the situation that happened, and it's wearing on me, and I don't want that to affect our friendship. So I need to let you know how that made me feel. So I always tell clients, anyone I'm talking to, focusing on the I statements. What is this about? How did this affect you? And then ultimately, what would you want that person to ideally do? So I think it can help that way. If you don't know the person, I think it's a little more difficult. But a lot of times people, especially with microaggressions, for the most part, people don't know that they kind of messed up. So if you can let them know, maybe they don't get it, but it'll plant a seed, and they might be less likely to engage in that same action or behavior again. That sort of help?
And I really like that, whether you know them or not. There's a saying we have in counseling that I help my clients. All you can do is give the information. It's up to them what they do with it. And so part of it is starting and personalizing I and educating the person, because the first step into dealing with oppression and being an advocate is educating. So I just want to educate you on how I felt.
Like I said, an example I say really quickly, and this is not about race, it's about being a woman. I went to a home show, where they have different, all kinds of different things that they do, whether it's landscaping, whether it's fixing your kitchen, all those other things. They have all kinds of people who do all those things. And people kept asking me, first of all, I was with my older brother, and I think we look exactly alike, so he couldn't have been my husband. So they were like, "Oh, are you with your husband?" And then when he left, they said, "Oh, is there a Mr. involved?" And my whole thought was, I could be with a woman.
Right.
Why do I need a Mr.? And eventually, I was walking around and just steam was coming out of my ears. And I said something to it was actually a younger guy. And I said, I noticed, I don't know if this is how you guys are taught, but this could be really offensive to a lot of people. And, you seem like a nice person, so I just want to let you know that don't assume someone can't be independently financially able to do these things. Or in addition, that they need to have a partner to do it. So that was like a situation where it was someone I didn't even know, but it was bothering me so much. And I thought of, you know what, I can potentially make a difference so that another person doesn't have the same experience.
Yellow sweatshirt? Yeah, she's at her hand.
Oh, sorry.
I'll come back, yeah.
This is Dr. Burge.
Yeah.
When you were introducing the idea of group-centered emotion,
Yeah.
you mentioned something about like individual members' actions.
Sure.
And when they potentially diverge from the group norm
Yeah.
or what have you.
Mhm.
Could you talk a little bit about how those individual actions then like reflect back on the group or impact the group emotion
Oh, yeah.
or perception?
Yeah, so just like as an example, so I'm a mixed methodologist. I do qualitative and quantitative methods, so I design like my own survey experiments, but I also do focus group studies to talk to people about, you know, their politics and their emotions. And some focus group studies that I was fielding a few years ago, we were talking about shame in particular, and one of my participants was a judge. And so she was like a juvenile court judge. And she said every time I watch the news, if she's like looking away from the TV and she hears a story about like crime, and she's like, please don't let them be black, right? Like this is what she's like, and she's a black woman. Please don't let them be black. And then she turns to the TV and she's like, because again, as a judge, in her position as a judge, and also as a black woman, right? There's a sense of like, people are expecting this story to quite possibly be about an African American person maybe killing another black person, because violent crime especially is race coded. Even though we know white people commit crimes, we have 2 channels devoted to them: investigation, discovery, oxygen, snapped marathons, right? Like, we know that white people also commit violent crimes, but it's when individuals that are in, especially these marginalized groups, are engaged in what one would consider like the stereotypical behavior, that the resulting emotion is like shame. Because you are being, well, what Du Bois said in the early 1900s, especially about black elites, being lumped with a mass of people that they have no control over. Like the reason why black elites, the writing is on being ashamed of oneself, that Du Bois wrote in the early 1900s. And he talks about black elites being ashamed of their racial identity. And in part it's because black people collectively, based on the color of their skin, when you walk in a room, these are the first things you notice about people. What is their race? Maybe if you're, I tell my students all the time, I'm like, if it's somebody who's blonde, you might already have some preconceived notions about what they are going to contribute to class. But when you're an African American person, you walk into a space, and you might be the only one or one of a couple. People already have a number of thoughts about you. And so the idea that a member of the group would be engaging in some stereotypical behavior that confirms that stereotype is very shameful, because it's like, oh, here we go again. And that initial research was actually done on the psychology side with Latinos. And witnessing other Latinos who were engaging in like stereotypical like Latin behavior, which is what these authors called it, who were all, I think 2 of them South American and one of them was Mexican. But like talking about all of these different behaviors that bring about like shame, and it's about these negative stereotypes, because you know that members outside of the group are already expecting people in that group to act like that. And you're being lumped with with those people. And so there's this sense of shame that comes about, because as members of the group, that is the way that you will also be viewed. I won't soapbox it, because I don't know. I'm like, some people get to be individuals, other people don't. But that's, there we go.
I think
Great
somebody
questions,
else- really
everyone.
good.
Yeah, there's 2 over here, so.
So how do you think our country can make resources more available for people who are struggling with mental illness, that they can't either afford the resources or they don't feel that it's available to them just based on poverty rates and social situations? What way do you think we as a nation can do that? I know it's very complicated.
I can say for me, I am very involved in my professional organizations. So the American Counseling Association, the Association for Multicultural Counseling and Development. As part of our profession, we advocate. So we advocate at the federal level, at the state level, and at the local level. So last summer, there was counselors from all over the world. We were down at the House and at the state talking to them about mental health. We are right now really trying to push, because right now for Medicare recipients, they're only able to see licensed clinical social workers, psychologists, marriage and family therapists licensed, and licensed professional counselors. Psychologists and social workers are saturated. So when we talk about these stigmas, if we have somebody who has Medicare and they want to come to my office, I'm not going to be able to bill their insurance. So we are really coming from a national level to get those laws changed, because that law has not been changed since 1989. So we're doing the same thing with the state. So we've been to Harrisburg and we're advocating. So when you say this country, I think it's really starting with professional organizations, getting involved in these advocacy groups, and really going to our politicians and trying to change these laws. I know also for me, I do this on an individual level, but I mentor those who are in counseling to do this. We have in our ethical codes that we provide pro bono services or sliding scale to be able to make it easier. And that is something that's really important to me, because of the population I work with, that there are high levels of stigmas.